Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today, I have a very special guest back on the podcast for the second time, Dan Feldman. If you aren't familiar with him, he was actually back on the podcast episode 246. So if you want to go check that out, go look at that. We talked about emotional eating, obesity, seed oils, body comp for powerlifters, and all that good stuff. But Dan, appreciate you coming back on. So real quick, if you aren't familiar with Dan, he is a registered dietitian. He has a master's degree in human nutrition. He's also a personal trainer, competitive powerlifter, and has his own telehealth practice. Appreciate you coming back on, man.
Yeah, man. Thank you for having me.
It's been a couple years, almost 2 years now to the date since we last chatted. Anything been going on in your world or anything like that over the last couple of years?
Yeah, so still, as you mentioned, my main gig is I own my own private practice. You're in the United States. Most of my clients use their health insurance to see me. The overwhelming majority do. So that's still my main gig. I've also started to teach other dietitians, mentor other dietitians how to do the same, how to build a private practice, insurance-based private practice. So starting on that as well, getting other dietitians in network with health insurance companies here. So that's been another wing of my business that I've been doing, but still the bulk of my time is spent one-on-one with clients, mostly telehealth, helping them with, it varies, but mostly body composition, fat loss, muscle gain, that kind of thing.
Yeah, all the fun stuff, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Do you do any in-person training?
No, I don't, even though I do have the certification too. I got the NASA personal training certification a few years back for a job that I had been working at the time and just decided to keep it, but I don't.
Cool. As far as powerlifting too, anything on that end? Are you still competing regularly on that or?
Yeah. I think my last competition was this past April. Before that was November of last year. So still doing some competitive powerlifting, more so just at the local level. Nothing too crazy. I think for anyone who cares, my dot score at my power meet last year was like 415 or 413, 414, which is decent. I'm not breaking any national or state or American records, but I can hold my own.
Do you have any, is it just more so like enjoyment or you want to continue
Enjoyment.
to enjoy? Okay. You're like,
Enjoyment. I do some competing for fun, but at the end of the day, it's hobby. I'm not looking to break any national records or something. It's a way in which I can work out and train and have a goal to work towards,
yeah.
just to make things more motivating.
That's what I was wondering. I didn't know if it was like, hey, it helps you stay motivated with training, just gives you something to work towards there.
Yeah, exactly.
So what does your kind of training look like for that? Is it mostly just like the power, like you mostly just work on strength side of things, or do you try to do a little bit of a blend of maybe like hypertrophy as well too, or do you add in other stuff? What does that kind of look like for you?
It's a blend. So obviously squat, bench, and deadlift. Mainly using those lifts as a form of just gaining strength and improving proficiency in those three major lifts, rather than using them as a vehicle for hypertrophy per se. But then it's just a lot of isolation work for hypertrophy specifically, ideally to increase my powerlifting total and just to be jacked or stay somewhat jacked, as so stuff like leg press, leg curls, fly machine, chest fly machine, row machine, lat pull downs, stuff of that nature, bicep curls, tricep cable extensions, delt raises, all of that fun stuff to build or at least maintain a solid muscular foundation while building strength.
Nice. And for you, is it like 4 days, 5 days? What was your kind of typical program look like there?
I think of it less in terms of days per week and more I've just got an Excel spreadsheet with all of the workouts and sets that I have to do, all the exercises, sets that I have to do. And I just try and ensure I get all of those done, whether that takes 6 days, 7 days, 8 days, 9 days, and then I just repeat from there. Realistically, it probably takes 4 to 5 days to get through everything. And I tend to separate my kind of main compound strength lifts, the big three, from I go to a powerlifting gym. That's a little bit of a drive for me, like half an hour for me to do my main big compound lifts. And then there's a gym in the apartment that I live in, which isn't really set up for doing heavy deadlifts and squats and bench per se. For a lot of the isolation stuff, I do that using the machines there, cables, whatnot. So I keep things pretty flexible rather than saying within this 7 day period, I have to do this on this day, this on that day. I go more based on readiness. I find that to be helpful. And sometimes it takes more than 7 days to get through everything, 8 days, 9 days, and that's totally fine.
It sounds like it's this combination of convenient, like obviously the time aspect of it and getting to the gym, the convenient side of things, the practicality of it, but also a recovery side of
Yeah.
things as well too. It's that combination that you're paying attention to there.
Yeah, exactly. If I feel like If today would be a day, I would do heavy squats, but I'm just not feeling up to it. I'll wait until the next day. And then if everything shifts over for the following week, it's fine. I don't care. So I try to keep things very flexible, especially as a business owner and just life, keep things pretty flexible there.
And I'm sure it's a good thing to also teach your clients as well too, if you dive into the training side of things about being flexible with exercise as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also tell people, especially this time of year, people get busier with the holidays, doing something rather than nothing at all. So for this week, for example, maybe you could hear it in my voice. I'm a little bit under the weather. Obviously, I'm bringing the volume down. I'm not kind of doing max effort, but I'm still doing something. And being able to do something, even if it's lighter, makes a big difference rather than doing nothing at all.
Yeah. From a nutrition perspective, what does that typically look like for you? Do you spend periods of time where you're in these kind of maybe surpluses, or is it mostly just like meat? What does that typically look like for you?
Yeah, I track my intake. I track my calorie and the macronutrient intake. Right now, I'm trying to be in a very small deficit to achieve a little bit of body recomposition. I've probably lost like 4 pounds over the past like 6 months, which, while it doesn't sound like a lot, my numbers, my strength numbers and numbers on my hypertrophy movements are generally going up a little bit. Body weight's going down a little bit. So that's the goal right now. So usually I'll be either maintenance, a very small deficit, very mild deficit, or a very mild surplus if I do want to go into a bulking phase with minimal body fat gain. So that's generally what things look like. I use an app called Macro Factor,
Yeah.
which it's from the folks from Stronger by Science. And as you may know, it uses your daily body weight, your daily weigh-ins, and the calories that you are logging each day to determine your maintenance, and it sets goals based on that. So I like that. It's very kind of responsive to changes over time.
I love that. And I guess with the recomp side of things, you said going a little bit, or was there any particular reason that maybe steered you in that direction versus the typical, oh, hey, you need to be in a little bit of a larger deficit? And just the fact that some people say, hey, you can't recomp and stuff like that as well, too.
For one, I prefer to have a little bit more food in me. I feel a little bit better, and I find that training goes pretty well. And I find I am able to make some modest progress even when I'm in a very small deficit. It's a way for me to get the best of both worlds. And I do think that body recomposition for a lot of folks is definitely doable. It just takes a lot of patience. It's really folks who are already quite lean and who are already at their genetic potential. Those folks would probably have a more difficult time achieving that recomposition.
And I feel like too, not saying you're in this position, but I also feel like people have never really had everything together at one point, right? It's, oh, hey, they've crushed the training side of things, but they never really focused on like the nutrition with it, right? Like making sure you're eating enough protein and just having good nutrition in general. And then even the lifestyle side of things too, right? Sleep, stress management, all that good stuff too.
So when you do have everything lined up, that combination of variables are all optimal, I would say for the vast majority of people, recomposition is doable.
And two, are you familiar with? I think it was a meta regression, I believe, by Murphy. I think Murphy was the last name. Potentially, I need to look up on this, but they talked about, hey, basically the smaller the deficit, the better that's going to be from like a lean body mass perspective. Are you familiar with that particular meta regression I'm talking about?
It sounds vaguely familiar.
Okay.
I don't remember if that was the one where they indicated like 500
Yep.
calories per day was where you really wouldn't see much lean mass gain. And it makes sense. The smaller the deficit, the more you'll be able to potentially gain muscle. I'd have to look at that study again. Obviously, there's a lot of factors that kind of go into that, such as how advanced someone is, already how muscular someone is, how close someone is to their genetic potential, how lean someone is, etc. So it definitely just depends on the individual.
Absolutely. And I know you're real big into the research as well too. Is there anything like, do you are you planning on maybe being involved in any research, or do you just like to look into the research and everything like that?
No, I just love staying up to date and
Yep.
summarizing new research. That's my thing. To actually do research, I have a limited exposure just from my master's program. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and it's not really something that either it doesn't pay or it doesn't pay very well. So it's not something that appeals to me. I can greatly respect people who do original research. I have a tremendous amount of respect for people who do that, given the work that's involved, but it's not for me. I prefer to just stay up to date and disseminate new research findings.
What are you most interested in at the moment?
There's obviously a lot of stuff, probably at the moment, just because of how it's affecting people so much right now, is the GLP-1s,
Mm.
the usual P1 medications, and the potential effects those are having even in areas outside of directly weight management. Like I just reviewed a study and it was a research letter. So it wasn't like a full study with a whole pre-registration and full methods available. So I think these are findings that we need to be replicated. But they found, for example, that people who were on weight lowering medications, such as the GLP-1 medications, actually, many of them reduced alcohol consumption in addition. That was like a new research letter that just came out. It needs to be replicated. I'm not saying that's like a definitive fact of something that happens, but the potential of these GLP-1 agonists, these weight loss medications, Wegovy, Ozempic, etc., I think we're going to see an explosion in new and interesting research and how they will affect overall health.
Do you, for your clients and patients that you see, do a lot, or a lot of them on GLP-1s and stuff like that? Or yeah.
I'm seeing it more and more. I'm seeing it more and more. Now, as a registered dietitian, it's outside of my scope I can't prescribe
Right.
medications and I can't make medication recommendations, but for people who are on them, I can help them ensure they're still getting the nutrition that they need. So I am seeing it more and more as the medications become more readily available for sure.
I feel like a lot of people poo-poo on those in the fitness industry, and man, they can be super helpful. I think if they have somebody like yourself or any coach watching them in combination from like a body comp standpoint, I think they can be great. I just feel like there's probably some people that abuse them and maybe don't use them under the right circumstances there, and that's maybe where some of that where you can get a bad rap, or where they can get that bad rap from.
Yeah, the potential for these medications to so drastically improve the quality of life of so many people. Because for you and me, for people who are really into fitness, this is like our whole thing. It's easy for us to, maybe stay leaner, to pay close attention to our nutrition. But for people who are not like in the thick of it, for a lot of people, it's really difficult to maintain a healthy body weight and it's not just due to like laziness. There's so many different factors that go into that. There are some genetic factors where some people are just predisposed to have a higher body fat set point for whatever reason. There's a lot of cultural factors. There's a lot of psychological factors. And I would say for probably the majority of people who are struggling, it's not necessarily a willpower issue. There's just so many different factors that can contribute to one's struggles with their body weight. And obviously, there's all the different physiological and psychological impacts, negative effects that can have. So for a lot of these people, these medications when taken appropriately, can be life-changing, literally. And there are people who have like this constant food noise, this psychological drive, to eat more and more. When it's like even when they are getting leaner, they're just thinking about food constantly. And for a lot of these people, these medications take that away. I think a lot of the people in the fitness industry who are poo-pooing them or saying people shouldn't use them, I think those people lack empathy, and it really changes when you can see how kind of people struggle. So yeah, they've definitely got a lot of potential to help a lot of people.
Like you said, too, people that are in the fitness industry, they maybe have never struggled with that and they've never been in those shoes. And from my understanding, it's as you gain body fat, whether, again, you're genetically predisposed to that, or again, maybe you just the modern environment, right? Whatever it is, you gain weight. It's once you get to those levels too, it overrides your satiety signal and everything. And I think that's like you said there, the food noise. This is where these medications can really come into play because
Yeah.
that system's all out of whack at that point.
Yeah, no, and we see that with a lot of people where even though we do have these physiological means by which our bodies are supposed to and our brains are supposed to regulate food consumption and appetite, we often see those signals, those kind of become out of whack for just so many different reasons. And it's not just laziness. So there's a lot there.
Yeah, there really is, right? It's simple on paper, but like when you really dive into it, like you said, there's a lot there. And again, the modern environment obviously does not help. I feel like if you aren't actively making choices in terms of that are going to help with your body weight or controlling your caloric intake, it's pretty easy to see your body weight come up if you're not actively doing things like that.
Yeah, we do live in an obesogenic environment, if I'm getting that term correctly. So it is definitely easier to gain a lot of weight because of how available hyper-palatable food is, high-calorie food is, and how our environment oftentimes is not conducive to getting a lot of physical activity. A lot of people are working more than ever. So yeah, absolutely.
Always think that's a good topic to chat about. I think this is a good kind of segue into one of the topics I wanted to talk about. And you made a post about calories in, calories out. Again, we know that's going to determine long-term change in your body weight. But again, there's many factors that are going to affect
Yeah.
calories in and many factors that are going to affect calories out. I just would like to chat with you about this in terms of how you teach this to people and maybe some things for people to look out for. And then I'm sure I'll have some specific questions as you chat about it a little bit more.
Body weight changes come down to calories, ultimately energy balance. However, energy balance is more complicated than most people realize. For one, accurately determining calories in, so calorie intake, we have research to indicate that most people tend to underestimate their food intake, their calorie intake. And it's not necessarily people are lying, but it's just from our natural biases, we tend to, whether it be eating unconsciously or underestimating portion sizes, most people, when they are tracking their calories, unless maybe they are with something they're very well versed in, because it is a skill to some extent, be able to measure and weigh your food, etc. Most people tend to underestimate how much they consume. Even dietitians, there is even research to indicate that even dietitians tend to underestimate their food intake. For one, a lot of people, maybe they think they're eating 1,200 calories, but they're really eating 2,000 calories. So very easy to do. In addition, when it comes to the calories inside of things, oftentimes they'll use like a MyFitnessPal, which will use like a standardized equation to determine their calorie and macronutrient needs. And then they'll just assume that, okay, this is the amount of calories I need to lose weight, period. Or they'll use an online calculator that maybe uses like a Mifflin St. Jean or Harris Benedict equation. They'll assume, okay, this is the amount of calories I need in order to be in a deficit. When in reality, whether it be like a MyFitnessPal and the equations that uses or online calculators, these are ballpark estimates as to how many calories someone needs to maintain weight and lose weight. Usually they just use someone's height, weight, age, gender, and activity level. However, these calculations have very wide margins of error because even among two individuals who are the same height, weight, age, and gender, there are various factors that can considerably affect how many calories they burn. One of the biggest ones is organ mass. Organ mass contributes to a large percentage of energy expenditure. It's like the energy consumed by our brain, our heart, and a few other organs as well. So if one person has like a slight alterations in that, obviously it's not something we can control. That's not something that you'll get from like a prediction equation, for example, or variances in bone structure, lean body mass, obviously. So there's when people, so again, one, people tend to underestimate their calorie intake. Two, people are using, what they think to be a calorie deficit of a certain number where that might not actually be the correct number. So those are a couple of major things. And people tend to look at calorie intake and body weight over a short period of time, where in reality, you and I both know that body weight changes over just like a few days or even a few weeks, especially for people who have a menstrual cycle, will vary based on changes in digestion. So if I had a big high fiber meal last night, I'm still digesting that. I've still gonna have to poop some of that out. So that will affect my weight for a few days. Changes in body water, muscle and liver glycogen, so stored carbohydrate in our muscles and liver, hormonal fluctuations, like I said, especially with a menstrual cycle. So over shorter periods of time, body weight will go up and down variably. So you might have this situation in which someone, one, maybe isn't very well trained with tracking their food intake, so they might not be totally accurate with what they're tracking. Two, they might be trying to follow a calorie target that actually isn't necessarily 100% accurate. It's just based off an estimation. And three, it's 3 days and they're eating in a quote unquote calorie deficit and their weight went up and this isn't working, screw it. I see some combination of those tends to occur with a lot of people. The solution I would say to that is one, with tracking, having a coach or dietitian to really guide someone, if someone is going to track their intake, to teach them how to do it in a way that's more accurate. And two, for the first several weeks, I pretty much always tell people, just if they are going to track their intake, track your daily body weight first thing in the morning after using the restroom, minimal clothing, and track your food intake as accurately as you can without a specific target. Do that for a few weeks and see what your body weight does. See how many calories you're consuming. If your body weight stays the same over 4 to 6 weeks, then you know that the average calories that you're consuming is roughly your maintenance. and to do things that way. There's also, I use, and we were talking about this earlier, I personally use an app called the Macro Factor, which kind of does some of that for you. You track and then it determines your goals based on your overall intake and how your weight changes. So there's that kind of side of things, which is why calories in, calories out is more complicated. And as for the calories outside of things, like I said, energy expenditure varies from person to person. And also, oftentimes people will make the mistake of they'll run for 30 minutes in their Apple Watch or Fitbit or the treadmill on the gym will say that they burned 300 calories and they'll subtract that from their food intake. You don't want to do that because these devices, Apple Watches, Fitbits, etc., aren't great at measuring energy expenditure in real time. You really need like research grade equipment to do that. And it doesn't account for the fact that if I do a bunch of cardio, you might see some lowering in energy expenditure for the other 23 hours in the day as your body tries to make up for that. That's the long-winded way of saying, yeah, yes, it is calories, calorie balance, calories in, calories out, but there's also some more nuance to that for people who are trying to manage their weight. They need to be more aware of.
And I feel like shoot, there's even more complexities that we can get into. I do have a couple questions, but you just hit the surface with a ton of information. But again, and this leads people to think like, oh, hey, calories in, calories out doesn't work. And it's again, it's I think like you said, people just think of it very static. It's just simple calories in, calories out, which it is, but there's also way more nuance to it. So like you said, diving into that more can be super helpful. I also feel like on one thing you mentioned too was what the cardio is. I feel like people will base what they burn and they think that's all they expend throughout the day as well too, right? When it's like, hey, there's so many other things that go into the energy out side of the equation as well too in that process. But the big things you mentioned there were like, hey, most people just aren't super accurate at tracking, right? So it's like the calories inside of things, people end up consuming more calories than they think. Calories outside of things, people use these kind of calculators, and those also just are going to get you within the ballpark, but they could be off, right? So then you see where there's this mismatch on there. So on the calories inside of things, you mentioned how we can be inaccurate. As a dietitian, I'm sure that maybe you could give me some more insight on this, but can't like the calories they put on things as well too be off by up to 20-25% or something along those lines?
I don't remember the exact percentage, but there is a percentage by which food labels might be off by. That is true. I don't remember what that exact margin of error can be. That is true. However, I don't think that's particularly relevant because as long as there's not like a systematic error where everything is higher calorie than what it's listed as, some things might be a little bit higher, some things might be a little bit lower, but overall that's going to balance out. If there's a margin of error of let's say 20%, if everything was off by 20% in the same direction, yes, that would be an issue, but I don't think there's any evidence of that being the case. So as long as things are evenly dispersed, it's going to wash out. Greg Nuckols wrote an article a while back about that, but
that is interesting.
Yeah, there is going to be some margin of error just because there's margin of error, but I don't think that is something that necessarily people need to worry about, and I don't think that's something that would necessarily contribute to like the obesity epidemic. So yes, things will be off to some extent. It's not going to be systematically off.
That makes sense. Like you said, it evens out. So it's, hey, it's some are going to be plus and minus. It's not like it's in one direction. So it's again not anything you necessarily need to be concerned about there. For people that they have trouble with this calories in and you feel like they're under reporting, what are some things that you really try to work on here to get more accurate with that?
First, obviously, tracking is not necessarily for everyone. For some people, and I would say even for people who do track, focusing on beneficial habit changes will be very helpful. So for a lot of people, potentially eating out less often, that's something that will be very beneficial, or eating more fruits and vegetables and limiting intake of very fatty foods, fried foods, of sweets, drinking a lot of water, reducing or eliminating caloric beverages, strategies to mitigate like stress eating, so alternative means of managing stress, things like that, irrespective of whether someone is tracking calories or not, will be beneficial. Now, as far as tracking specifically and improving tracking accuracy, I will occasionally send people like a tracking audit, and I've posted this on Instagram before. It's actually the person who first posted it. Her Instagram is at BRIT_RAND, Brit Rand. And I've just reposted it. And she goes through and she'll have different points. So, for example, auditing someone's tracking habits, are they tracking alcohol? Are they counting all carbohydrates rather than just net carbohydrates? For people who really focus on macros specifically, or people weighing their food in grams and ounces rather than measuring via cups and spoons. That's something that can be a source of error. Are people tracking, people who use a lot of gum, mint, hard candy, are people tracking that? Are people more scanning barcodes or weighing foods rather than eyeballing or estimating? As I hit on before, not subtracting exercise calories from total calories. When people do scan items, double checking the accuracy, tracking vegetables. People just eat vegetables and don't track them. Condiments, sauces, creamers, oil, butter, all of that has calories. If someone tracks a piece of meat and they're weighing it raw, is the entry they're using in their app raw? Or if they're weighing up cooked, does the entry match as cooked? Are people weighing pasta, oatmeal, rice dry and ensuring that the entry in their app is for dry rather than cooked? You know what I mean? Tracking bites, tastes, and licks here and there. Like if there's a babka, that's if I'm at my family's house, sometimes we'll get like a babka to have. And sometimes throughout the day, I'll just be walking around. I'll be like, oh, a little chocolate babka. I'll take a little bit here and there. That can add up to several hundred calories. So things like that. Yeah. So going through an audit like that, and oftentimes one or more of those factors can be affecting someone's accuracy there.
Whenever I do these with clients, it's a couple things. First, it's typically, oh, I'm not doing any of that stuff, right? I'm weighing everything out. That's the first thing. I feel like sometimes, I don't know, I feel like people maybe get a little defensive with this side of things. And then on top of it, the second thing I wanted to say, here, we'll hit on that first. Is that something that you typically see there too, is when you bring that up?
Yeah, so you have to be careful when you do that, and it's very important to not come across as saying, I don't believe you.
Yeah.
Something I try and throw myself under the bus whenever possible. So I say, if I go back to some of those points, I'll say, so here I'll tell someone what I'd like to do is go through an audit of some of your tracking. A lot of people, myself included, sometimes there are things that can be missed. And then I'll go through some of these and I'll use an example of like myself. I'll be like, hey, like any kind of bites or tastes, like for me, for example, I'll sometimes if there's like a chocolate babka, this or that, even if it's not necessarily true, even if I'm making something up, I'll try and be like something I might do, which I need to be careful of for myself. You know what I mean? So really throw myself under the bus whenever possible to let the guard down a little bit. And also just being respectful and also talking about how not that this client in particular, but people in general, in talking about how the research shows this.
Right.
And the research shows, like I said earlier, how even dietitians. So this is a human thing. This is not like a client personal thing. It would be helpful.
Yeah, no, all good points. Yeah, tying it back to how you do the same thing. And then also, again, it's just not them specifically. It's just generally speaking, looking at the research and everything like that. We have, it backs that up.
Yeah, exactly.
And the other thing I was going to say is also, I think it's important to, you hit on this too, but it's typically not one thing. It's usually the combination of things, right? Where things really start to add up, right? Because people want to pinpoint the one thing, but it's like, hey, you're probably doing a little bit of that. You're probably doing a little bit of this. And that's where it starts to add up over time, where it's, if you are trying to be in that, you're trying to fat loss diet and you're stuck at maintenance, that can easily happen. And now you're at maintenance and that's a big reason why things aren't trending down like you want.
Exactly. So like you said, it is a combination of different things as to why someone might be at maintenance when they really want to be in that deficit.
And then, so that's the calories inside of things. Obviously, again, I feel like that side's a little bit simpler, but there's still a lot of things that you can go into on that. But then the calories out, you mentioned there's genetics, so many different things that play a role. But again, I think one thing is, you haven't mentioned on your post here, but for example, energy availability. So the energy balance we're into is going to be something that can impact it, right? I think that's another thing where when people say that calories in, calories out doesn't matter, right? Or whatever it may be, it's they're think of it as this kind of static thing. Whereas again, the calories you bring in is going to impact the energy outside of things. Is that something that you typically see? Or
yeah, so that does affect things. So if someone is in a state of low energy availability, which means that essentially means they're not eating enough to support basic life functions. Oftentimes you see this if someone is already has somewhat low body fat levels and they're eating relatively low calories. And they're doing a pretty good amount of exercise, the calories that they are consuming is maybe insufficient for all of their just necessary life processes. You see this with the female athlete triad, with kind of women who are exerting a lot of calories from exercise and are just eating pretty low calories, you start to see some functions in the body downregulate. That's where you can see a loss of a menstrual cycle or aberrations in a menstrual cycle because the body is trying to conserve energy to not utilize those functions. So in the same way, if someone is in a state like that, or they're just in general in a state where their body just doesn't have enough energy, be it the energy they're consuming or the energy that they have stored as stored body fat, you're going to see a lowering of metabolic rate to some extent, and it varies from person to person. And that is the body's way of not starving to death and death of conserving energy. And there's a lot of kind of things that underlie it. It can be at the level of the mito. If someone is eating a very low calorie diet and or they have pretty low body fat levels, the body is going to compensate by reducing metabolic rate to some degree. So that can also explain why people might not be able to see that needle move. And that's sometimes a conversation where you have to have with someone where is their goal too arduous for them? Are we getting into unhealthy territory? And I see that with a lot with people who do want to lose fat for aesthetic purposes. Sometimes you do get into that territory where someone has to eat very low calories in order to continue to lose weight or to see the results that they want to see.
And yeah, and you just have to decide if that trade-off is worth it to you or not there. And then you have a couple other ones listed on here, and I think they all impact what we talked about too, right? So a couple of them would be like your NEAT, hormones as well too, right? I would imagine that, again, same thing here. It's from an energy availability standpoint, depending on the energy balance you're in, that's probably going to impact your NEAT to an extent, right? And then same thing with hormones as well too. Some of these things all
they link together. Yeah, absolutely, definitely with some of those stuff, like with someone who sees a compensatory reduction in energy expenditure due to eating very low calories or being very low body fat or what have you. You might see that reflected in certain hormones. You might see some of that reflected in NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, just a fancy way of saying non-exercise movement. You'll see a spontaneous reduction in that. Like the classic example is for like physique athletes who are going to very low body fats. Sometimes they will report just like having less energy, being more sluggish, just moving around less in general. That can play a role there as well. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of variability there.
and I'm sure you've seen this yourself, right? Where it's like you do from NEAT perspective, for example, it's like you notice that maybe you're not thinking as clearly, or you're a little bit slower, or you just don't want to move as much, right? Like you just feel generally tired, but then you eat a little bit more calories and you feel good, and then all of a sudden now you ramp that up. And again, to make this even more complex, I'm sure that is also very dependent on the person as well too, in terms of how that is regulated as well. So I think really what we're trying to get at here is there's just so many different things that go into this, and we'll wrap this up in terms of what are some takeaways in terms of how to, okay, so what does all this mean? But I think the real big thing here is just want to really emphasize how this isn't just this perfect calorie equation, or it isn't this perfect equation. There's a lot of things that impact it. And then lastly, the last one I want to ask you about is muscle. What's muscle's role in the energy outside of things?
Muscle tissue in and of itself, by having it on you, does burn some calories. I believe I've written about it before. It's somewhere in the vicinity of 14 calories per pound. Not a huge amount, but there is some role there. And when you have more muscle, gaining 5 pounds of muscle will increase your baseline energy expenditure. For one, just if you have more weight on you, you will burn more calories. Just like a bigger body, a heavier body burns more calories. And relative to fat, muscle is going to be a bit more metabolically active, so it will burn more calories. It's still not a ton, but in addition to that, there's also the amount of muscle that you have will also play a role in potentially increasing non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So gaining muscle will to some extent increase your energy expenditure. I do think a lot of physique athletes and a lot of like people who lift weights may overstate that effect, but there is some effect. Having more muscle on your frame will to some degree increase your energy expenditure, and it'll increase the amount of energy expenditure through NEAT. But the amount that is will vary from person to person, and it's not like a tremendous amount.
Yeah, like you said, overplayed a little bit. And again, I would assuming the 14 you mentioned the like 14 calories. I'm assuming that's at rest, right? When you're not equating for everything else. It's if you were just at rest, that's how much it would.
Yeah. Okay. So let me correct myself. So I'm looking at it right now, and this is actually an article from Greg Nichols from Stronger by Science from 2023. At rest, skeletal muscle burns about 6 calories per pound, 13 calories per kilogram.
Got you. Okay.
There is some increase with regard to the effect when you take into account NEAT, so that will play a role as well. It's still not going to be a huge amount, but there is going to be some kind of increase in there. So it will increase energy expenditure to some extent.
And again, like you said, just being a bigger body weight is obviously going to be something that's going to play a role there, right? So if you're someone who's just trying to lose weight, you don't really care if it's fat or muscle. It's like you're just going to be smaller. And again, that's not going to help the energy expenditure side of things.
So having a larger body will increase more expenditure. And something actually, I'm just looking through Greg Knuckles' article, and he clarifies so that like I said, like about 6 calories per pound of muscle at rest. If you're more active, that will go up because having more muscle when you're more active will increase energy expenditure by some extent. So if you're very sedentary, gaining a pound of muscle might increase your total energy expenditure by, say, 7 calories. Whereas if you're very active, gaining a pound of muscle might increase your total energy expenditure by, say, 12 calories. So not a tremendous amount for someone who's untrained. They, over the course of a few years, gain 20 pounds of muscle, 25 pounds of muscle, which for someone who's just starting out, who has not worked out before, I think is very reasonable. You're looking at a pretty decent amount. That's somewhere between a couple hundred calories, or just varies from person to person. So there is an effect. And obviously, I'm a little bit biased here being a powerlifter, but having more lean mass will generally be a positive for overall health and long-term mortality and just quality of life.
As you're saying this, we obviously want that little bit of an added benefit on there, but at the end of the day, most people, again, people listen to this, we obviously, I feel like have more muscle than probably the general population does, but for most people, we're under muscled, so we probably need to add some muscle. And there's really no downside to it. And it's not necessarily the easiest to build. Like you said, initially you can get some, but past that point, it's not easy to build past that point.
Yeah. So building a reasonable amount of muscle, not saying people have to be like Arnold Schwarzenegger, right, but for people who aren't currently doing weight-bearing exercise, assuming they're physically able to do weight-bearing exercise and gain some lean mass, that will have benefits. It will benefit their potential ability to lose weight, but will benefit their energy expenditure, and just more generally, they'll have a lot of benefits.
Yeah, it reminds me of creatine, right? It's, hey, you don't necessarily need, you do want to have some muscle, so it's not the greatest one-to-one, but it's like a low risk. Hey, there's a lot of potential upsides of doing it there.
It's like the why not.
Yep. Yeah. Cool. So I guess just to wrap up this calorie balance talk again, because we went into a lot, and I don't think people necessarily need to get caught up in all these little things, but I think it's important to know just so people have the education around, okay, hey, it isn't just the straight calories in, calories out. There's more that goes into it. So really at the end of the day, you hit on it. Best way to know is tracking your body weight over time there to really figure out where you're at.
Yeah. Tracking your intake accurately and tracking your body weight on a daily basis. 2 to 6 weeks, I would say those with a menstrual cycle might need to go a bit longer.
And I always tell people too in this situation, and I'm sure you do too, it's, hey, we also want to potentially look at measurements, especially around the midsection, look at clothes, progress pictures, because sometimes just because your weight's not trending in the direction you want doesn't necessarily mean you're not improving your body comp, depending on where you're at, obviously, as well too.
Right, that's true.
Cool. Then next topic I want to bring up, and we don't need to spend too much time about this. Where people say BMI is not necessarily anything we need to worry about. What are your kind of thoughts on this? Where do you stand on the BMI talk?
So BMI from a population level perspective is pretty decent when it comes to estimating adiposity, so kind of overall levels of body fat and where someone is at in terms of their risk for long-term mortality. Now, for those who are like again, this is looking at general population, for those who are in like the overweight category, that those individuals may not necessarily be at strong risk. But for people who aren't resistance training and who have BMIs like 30 plus, generally speaking, they'll probably be at an increased risk for metabolic conditions. For those who do weight-bearing exercise, obviously that changes because BMI is just looking at your height and weight. Muscle adds to your weight. It doesn't add to your height, unfortunately for me. Yeah, but it will inflate your BMI. That being said, on an individual basis, at the most, BMI should be used as a screening tool, in my opinion. So I don't think, and I'll see doctors do this a lot, where a doctor will look at their BMI and it's like, oh, it's 26, you're overweight, it needs to be 24. I don't think that's appropriate. It's a very coarse screening tool, is what I would say. So I think if someone does have a BMI that's elevated, first, if it's 25 to 30, maybe just check. Is this person have more muscle than average? If so, it's probably not anything to worry about. If not, okay, what's their waist circumference and what are their kind of metabolic markers, their blood sugar, their blood pressure, their lipids, etc. And if someone has a BMI much over 30, then you want to really start to look at their, like I said, their metabolic health, which again, waist circumference, blood sugar, A1C, blood pressure, blood lipids, so cholesterol, triglycerides. Like I said, it's like a screening tool to look at those factors that I think will be more directly reflective of whether someone's at risk for cardiometabolic diseases, which is basically like your diseases that are associated with obesity, your heart disease, certain types of cancer, stuff of that nature. So if anything, I might argue that even something like waist circumference would be probably a bit of a better measurement. So BMI, it's not useless. It does to some extent correlate with metabolic health, but it should not be used as a standalone health measure. It should be interpreted with caution and specifically on an individual basis. If someone wants to determine, here's the other thing. Sometimes I'll have people come to me and ask me what their ideal weight should be. And that is very individual dependent. I don't recommend using a BMI for that because it will be a little bit arbitrary. From an individual perspective, from a health perspective, I would more so look at those more objective markers that I just alluded to. So the waist circumference and the blood sugar, A1C, blood lipids, blood pressure. If those are all within normal limits, then it's just a matter of if, in my opinion, if someone feels comfortable with their current body weight. It's not useless. It's a decent screening tool, but it's obviously should not be used as a standalone. There's obviously a lot of limitations because it's only looking at height and weight.
Yeah, so like you said, it gives you an idea of kind of what's going on. It allows you to look into things a little bit more, but you don't just want to you don't want to put too much stock into one unless you obviously, like you said, you start to get into these obese categories or higher. It's okay. Hey, we probably need to look at this a little bit more because, and like you said, it comes down to, all right, we also want to look at, are they resistance training, their metabolic health and everything like that. But I would imagine that once you get to that 30 or higher, it's the chances of that being the case is probably starts to dwindle.
Yeah, unless you're someone who has like a lot of muscle.
You have to go out of your way.
Yeah, and if you're that person, you know you're that person. Right. So yeah.
Because I feel like people, and again, I don't know if you see this commonly, but I feel like a lot of people, they lift some weights, maybe they're in that obese category. I think they tend to maybe overestimate how much muscle they have usually at that.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common as well. People who kind of lift weights more casually think I'm completely outlier and I must have 30 pounds of muscle, 40 pounds of muscle.
Yeah. No, I like the way you summed it up. Again, we just need to use it as a tool. And then if you're in the overweight category and you're resistance training, you're probably in a good spot. Again, could be some things you could potentially do. I know for me, I'm 5'6", 5'6.5". So it's for me, it tells me I am overweight. But again, I make sure I do all the stuff, right? So I'm not as concerned about it at that point.
Yeah, same for me. I'm 5'4". And even when I was at my leanest a couple of years back, where I was like, my face looked gaunt, but I had I was pretty shredded. I was like 150. It still said I was overweight. So like for me to be in the healthy BMI range, just with my lack of height and my bone structure, it would be actually unhealthy for me.
You'd have to probably lose some muscle in that process.
I would, yes.
Which, again, we just talked about all the benefits of it and why you probably don't want to do that. And you don't necessarily just want to be a smaller version of yourself. You do want to make sure you have that lean body mass too. Cool. Great summary. I just get a lot of questions on BMI, so I thought that was super interesting to dive into that. Last topic of the day, I want to just chat about fats. I think for people who are in physique and track their macros, I've noticed that fats, I feel like, kind of get lost in the equation, right? I think a lot of people, just when I look at people's diet logs and again macros, you typically see fats being something that's kept to pretty low. And then I think fat sources are also an issue for people who do consume when they don't consume enough fats and just in general there. What's the importance of getting enough fats, and then what are the minimums that we're looking for here with them?
Yeah, so you do need some amount of dietary fat for just general health purposes. We do have our essential fatty acids, so that's our omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. If something is essential, that means you need to consume it. Just we have essential amino acids. There are certain amino acids, certain building blocks of protein we need to consume. Same thing with fats, right? So omega-3s and omega-6s we need to have. And eating very low fat can lead to health issues. Extreme fat restriction can increase the risk of developing gallstones. That said, you need to consume, generally speaking, if you're consuming at least 12 grams of fat per day, you should be in a good spot there. As for essential fatty acids, I'd say most people, if they're consuming maybe at least 20 grams of fat per day, they should be getting enough of their fatty acids. Also, so we have our fat soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. Those, we really need to have some fat in our diet to assist in the absorption of those. If you are consuming a supplement for vitamin A, D, E, or K, I would recommend having that with a meal that contains some fat. It's tough to come up with an exact number, but generally 20, if someone's something like at least like 20-ish grams per day, it's probably decent. And then sex hormones. We do need fat to some extent for production of testosterone, estrogen, stuff like that. So obviously that's important not just for general health, but for physique, performance, etc. Exactly how much we need, it definitely varies depending on the person. And I think in general, what would be considered a minimum depends on the person. The general recommendations for US adults is to consume 20 to 35% of their total calories from dietary fats. So generally speaking, I try not to keep fat much below 20% overall of one's daily calories. If someone's consuming like 2,000 calories per day, that would be a minimum of, I think, approximately like 40 grams per day or so. Generally speaking, I think that 20% minimum of calories for most people would be sufficient. I don't think people need to go super crazy, measuring exactly how much kind of fat they should be having for a lot of, especially a lot of like physique or strength athletes. To some extent, carbs and fats are somewhat interchangeable. You just don't want to go really low. And consuming a diet with a lot of saturated fat can increase the potential for someone to have high cholesterol, high LDL cholesterol, and heart disease down the road. So limiting saturated fat. I think more fats come from plant sources. Like I said, ideally like 20% is like the baseline 20% of total calories, which if someone's eating a 2,000 calorie diet would be like 40 grams per day. It's like a bottom.
So do you commonly see that too with maybe people who have a background of like macro tracking or a little bit more physique focused, that fats tend to be on the lower end? And then you also mentioned the other thing I wanted to get at is the fat sources, right? So it's either, this is what I commonly see. I'd be curious to see but it's either low fat or and those fats are made up of just, again, mostly saturated fat, or it's like really high fat content, but it's also, again, more like saturated fat.
Yeah, I do see from people who are mostly like the keto folk, those tend to be really high saturated fat, which I would say is not ideal. I don't see very low fat intakes that often, but when I do see it, oftentimes it's maybe women who have a history of chronic dieting or potentially men who are really prioritizing getting as lean as possible. It's not that common, to be honest. I would say it's more very fitness oriented folks people who might have a history of disordered eating, or people who just have that background of tracking very diligently, or of physique athletes who might have that fat intake very low because they want to keep carbs higher for training quality and protein higher for muscle strength and composition. And yes, oftentimes when people are more so keto, low carb, high fat, oftentimes we see those fats tend to come from animal sources, full fat dairy, bacon, red meat, etc.
Yeah, and I wanted to put them because, like you said, generally speaking, I'm sure people consume plenty of fats, right? Like overall,
Yeah.
but again, it's that, like you said, the person that's really trying to push it and they're really watching their caloric intake. At some point, you got to decrease from something, and so that, because yes, I do feel like most people probably consume way too many fats overall from that perspective. So you hit on saturated fats, some sources there. What would be some like fat sources, like actual food sources that we'd want to get? Like, what are some good sources of fat?
Yeah, so mostly plant sources of fat. So like your nuts, your avocados, your olive oil. A lot of people I think we talked about seed oils last time, so I'm not going to get too much into that. I would argue that the plant-based oils, even like your canola and safflower oil or sesame oil, will actually be more beneficial than something like beef tallow or lard or something like that if we just look at data on like cardiovascular disease risk. But plant sources of fats, like I said, your nuts, also fish, fatty fish, not fish that's breaded or fried, but the fat that's naturally in fish, like the omega-3s from like salmon or something like that, also very beneficial. So that's basically be your omega-3s, your omega-6s, and your monounsaturated fats are going to be the real beneficial ones. It's not that you can't have any saturated fats, but there is definitely a link between very high saturated fat intakes and cardiovascular disease risk. So more so of those plant based sources of fats, like I mentioned.
Which, again, like we talked about, most people are going to shift more towards the saturated side and miss out on that. What avocados would that be?
Yeah. That's going to be like your monounsaturated fats, so
Yeah,
definitely very good in
yeah.
terms of cardiovascular health.
From a saturated fat standpoint, you said, hey, look, we don't want to necessarily not have any saturated fat, right? We don't want to do that. But what do you strive for that? Is there any particular number you try to aim for? Or is it just, again, you're just generally looking at like, all right, let's just look and make sure that we're getting some of these healthier fats in the diet?
I'm more so just the latter. If someone's calories are where they need to be and their fat intake isn't like egregiously high, I don't worry too much about it. If someone is very specifically trying to reduce their cholesterol, then I might say, okay, is saturated fat at less than 10% of total calorie intake? If not, let's lower it. If someone is specifically trying to reduce their cholesterol.
Yeah. In this situation, so it sounds like, again, you'd be a little bit more concerned about overall caloric intake. And then again, just dialing in, making
Yeah.
sure you're just not going out of whack, essentially, with that.
Yeah, exactly. Just looking at those kind of big picture things.
Cool. Is there anything else on fats that maybe we didn't hit on that you want to, like, any takeaways from fats or anything like that?
Not really. Again, I mean, with the seed oils, people are going to believe what they want to believe. So generally speaking, trying not to consume an excessive amount of saturated fat. Trans fats are really bad, but we don't really see that in the food supply anymore. Yeah, prioritizing plant sources of fats as well as the fat that kind of comes naturally in fish.
Yeah, it is funny with the seed oil talk and all that. People will demonize that stuff, and it's, look, if you're taking care of the big rocks and like you have a little bit of, I just don't understand why people want to make such a big deal about small things like that. I feel like if anything, it just leads to more issues for people than anything.
Yeah, and actually, if we look at kind of substitution analyses, replacing saturated fat with the plant-based sources of fats, including the fats that are in seed oils, will actually improve outcomes. But people will believe what they want to believe.
And find the research that they want to back up what they say. And right.
Sure.
But yeah, and again, also I feel like people take this as, oh, hey, you don't think seed oils are bad, so you're just telling people to go and consume all kinds of that type of food. And it's, no, that's also not what I'm saying either.
Sure. Yeah, it's at the end of the day, if someone's calories are where they need to be, they're kind of able to maintain a healthy body weight. Their overall metabolic markers where they need to be. They're doing some strength training, eating a good amount of fruits and vegetables. Those are really kind of the big things.
And I'm sure there at that point, it really just comes down to how in depth do you, really a personal choice then at that point. But it's hard to, I feel like, completely omit that from your diet altogether, especially if you like to have any sort of social life or anything like that. So,
of course.
Cool, Dan. Really appreciate your time, man. Is there anywhere where you want to lead the audience to, anything coming out on your end that you want to lead them to or anything like that?
I'll be in the coming months. My friend Melissa and I will be releasing a course that's specifically on nutrition for powerlifters. We'll be discussing that. You can follow me at Powerlifter Dietitian. I'll discuss more about that as it comes closer. It'll be at some point in the next few months or so. We'll be releasing that. It'll be a pretty in-depth course on nutrition for powerlifting. Be it if you're a powerlifter or you're a coach working with powerlifters, you'll find it very interesting.
Awesome. Cool. And then as far as, I know you mentioned your Instagram, is there anywhere else where you want to lead the audience to?
I would say generally my Instagram is the best spot. I am on TikTok at Powerlifter Dietitian. I don't really use it that much, but I do exist on there as well as YouTube. But I would say Instagram is probably the best spot for me. I do in the link in my bio on Instagram, I also have an email list where every couple of weeks or so I send some summaries of the latest research I found interesting, and I end each email with a one-liner.
Awesome. Cool. We'll make sure we link all that stuff in the show notes. Dan, appreciate your time, man, and we'll chat with you next time.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you.